Welcome, everyone. My name is Tina Sachs. I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare and the faculty director of the Center for Research on Social Change. And I am delighted to welcome you all here and I'm so excited for this afternoon's talk. I'd like to, first of all, this afternoon's talk is Racism, Plutocracy, and the 2020 election. I'm sure given everything that's going on of late, we have a lot to discuss. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Townsend Center for the Humanities, for helping us with this event. Before we begin, I would like to announce the Center for Research on Social Change's next event, which is on Thursday, April 30th. This event is called Empirics of Justice, Tracking the Carceral Continuum in Urban America, with Carla Shedd. Carla is an associate professor of urban education at the City University of New York. And this event will take place at Berkeley Way West, which is at 2121 Berkeley Way in room 1102. And if you sign up for our email list, we will send you a reminder for that event as it gets closer. I'd like to ask all of you to turn off your cell phones. And the format for this event is that Professor Haney López will speak for about 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Haney López, Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law here at UC Berkeley. He is one of the nation's leading scholars on how racism has evolved since the Civil Rights era. His current research emphasizes the connection between politics, racial divisions in society, and growing wealth inequality in the United States. He shares his research with a broad audience in outlets such as the New York Times and National Public Radio. His groundbreaking books include Dogmas of Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class, Racism on Trial, The Chicano Fight for Justice, and White by Law. Today's talk draws from his most recent book, Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, which was published last year. I would like to, before we begin, before we go to Professor Lopez, I would like to ask people to stay for snacks and conversation afterwards out in the hallway. And with that, I would like to please ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Haney López.
Hi, everyone. So, racism, plutocracy, and the 2020 election. Not a big subject. We'll blaze through this very quickly. Let me enter into this conversation by telling you two stories. And so in one of them, to set the scene, imagine one of these large hotel ballrooms. No windows, high ceilings, fake glass chandeliers, muted patterns in the carpet. This is a room that contains 50 state leaders from a trade union, plus a few other members of the national trade union leadership. They're on a winter retreat. This is in Miami, Florida. As I look around the room, most of these are big white guys. This is a trade union. They start talking about the demographics and the future of their movement. More than 90% white, more than 90% male, losing members steadily. And then they turn it over to me. And I, as this slight Latino academic from Berkeley, am supposed to talk to these union guys about racism. So I open up by saying, hey, do you all have a racism problem in your unions? And there's a smattering of laughter around the room. And a kind of a, and I hear somebody say under his breath, well, we have racism. And then somebody else retorts, it's not a problem. And I'm like, so it's not an auspicious beginning. And as I try and understand what's happening, I understand that part of it is they sense that they're about to get another lecture on racism and they're not into it. But at the same time, I want to be fair to the union. This is not going to be a story in which, I tell you a story about these union white guys who don't get it. This is the union leadership. They get it. They've been talking about race and divisions in their unions and how to build worker solidarity for decades. And these are the guys who are in charge of doing that. So there's this deep skepticism, but there is still at the same time more of an openness to the conversation I'm about to have with them than with most progressives. Because the conversation I'm about to have with them is about racism as a weapon of the rich. And the way I have that conversation is by starting with Lyndon Johnson and the War on Poverty. I say it's 1964, Lyndon Johnson, he's proposing a war on poverty. He's promising to end poverty in a decade. And there's landslide support for him. But what's happening? Well, running against him is this guy called Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater represents a faction within the Republican Party. Goldwater is this throwback to the old Republican Party, the party that strongly favored the economic elites. Goldwater himself is a scion of a wealthy retail family in Arizona. Goldwater's perspective is government ought not to do anything for regular Americans, but instead ought to reduce taxes on the rich, should get out of the way of the marketplace, should let the rich do what they do best, and that the country will benefit from it. And this is Goldwater's position. But Goldwater knows in 1963, as he's looking forward to the next year, to his run the next year, that this argument is going to lose, and lose big. So he decides, with a small group of Republicans, that they're going to adopt a different strategy. Up to then, the Republican Party has been relatively racially moderate. But Goldwater looks around and he says, LBJ and the war on poverty, well, he's also promoting civil rights. And there's an increasing anxiety among white voters about integration, white voters in the South and across the nation. What if we appeal to white racial resentment as a way to break the New Deal coalition? The New Deal coalition of the white working class, African Americans, and white liberals. What if we use racial resentment? But, the thinking goes, precisely because of the civil rights movement, our appeal to white racial resentment can't be naked. It can't be in the language of white supremacy. It can't be in the language that is being used at that time by Southern Democrats, by Jim Crow segregationist Southern Democrats. So Goldwater says, let's talk in code. In fact, he says, let's go hunting where the ducks are. And what he means is, let's use coded phrases that communicate a defense of white interests, but that are not naked about that political position. One of them was states' rights. Goldwater says, let's talk about states' rights. At a time when Southerners understood that states' rights meant the right of Southern states to resist federal pressure, that they stopped using violence and their laws to oppress and humiliate African Americans. Or Goldwater said, let's talk about freedom of association, as if people have a burning desire to debate philosophical questions. No, because people understood freedom of association meant the right of whites to decide with whom to do business, or with whom to rent or to sell their place. Goldwater has switched to what we would come to call dog whistles. These are terms that are designed to trigger racist fears and stereotypes, and to allow plausible deniability, because they're in code. And I want to pause for just a second. Please note, I am not defining a dog whistle in the typical way the dog whistle is defined. Over and over again, we hear that a dog whistle is speaking in code, as if the code is the problem. The code's hardly the problem. Language is always ambiguous. Politicians always speak in ways that are open to multiple interpretations. That's not a problem, that's retail politics. What makes dog whistle politics pernicious and something we should condemn, is that it's a purposeful attempt to trigger racist fears and resentments, or more generally, an attempt to trigger socially unacceptable hierarchies, resentments, and hatreds. It can be race, it can be gender, it can be sexual orientation or religion or citizenship, but the idea is that the dog whistle politician is seeking to trigger a socially unacceptable hatred and is using the code in order to maintain plausible deniability. So Goldwater, states' rights, freedom of association. But he's running against Lyndon Johnson, who's saying civil rights, but he's also saying war on poverty, we're going to take care of Americans, we're going to use activist government. And what are we going to do with activist government? We're going to tax the rich, we're going to redistribute wealth downwards, we're going to support unions, we're going to build ladders of upward mobility, we're going to regulate the marketplace, and union members and Americans as a whole, including almost 70% of whites, say hell yes. And they vote for Lyndon Johnson. And this, I say, to the union members gathered then, was the beginning of the end for their union. Because, though Johnson won that election, Johnson was the last Democratic candidate for president to win a majority of the white vote. Because Goldwater, or at least Goldwater's strategic innovation, has won the war. Goldwater didn't. But Richard Nixon in '68 shifted late in the campaign to dog whistling. And then number crunchers started looking at the results and they said to Nixon, you know, you've been calling it a Southern strategy. But this didn't just work in the South, it worked across the nation. And in 1970, Richard Nixon goes full dog whistle. States' rights and freedom of association. But he also begins talking about forced busing, the northern analog to states' rights. Pretending that the issue is putting children on school buses, as opposed to the real sort of source of the emotional wallop of that phrase, the idea that white children should go to school with black children. Or Richard Nixon starts talking about law and order, and the silent majority, and gangs and crime. And Richard Nixon, in 1972, wins in a landslide that is even larger than Lyndon Johnson's. 8 years later, we see the tectonic shift in American politics we continue to live with. And I say to these union guys, that might have been your dads. They might have been among those union hard hats who shifted to Richard Nixon. And I say, the real attention now has to be on the so-called Reagan Democrats. So many of them union members. And why the Reagan Democrats? Because of Ronald Reagan's innovation. Ronald Reagan, who gets his start as a spokesperson for Barry Goldwater. Now, Richard Nixon, he had been a moderate Republican, not Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's commitments are Goldwater's. Use racial resentment, but also campaign on behalf of rule by and for the rich. And Reagan combines them. So think about Reagan's story of the welfare queen. We understand references to the welfare queen as a classic dog whistle. It's a way to trigger racist stereotypes about African Americans, African American women in particular. Obviously, anytime you're telling a story about African Americans, you're also implicitly telling a story about whites. And so you can understand that the welfare queen story is a story about lazy and undeserving black people and innocent and hardworking whites. But the evil genius of welfare queen is it's doing double duty. It's not just a story about race, it's a story about government. And the story that Reagan is telling about government is that government is the biggest enemy in the lives of working people. Why? Resent people of color, he says. They're lazy. They'd rather rip off the system than do a hard day's work. And fear people of color. They're dangerous, they're inherently violent, they're criminals, they're gangsters. But hate government. Hate government. Because it's government that sticks its hands in your pocket and takes out those dollars from your wallet in the form of taxes to give to those undeserving and lazy and larcenous black and brown people. And it's government that refuses to use the criminal law to crack down on those criminals. Or it's government that leaves the border open and allows those dangerous brown people in. yes, resent and fear people of color, but hate government. And when Reagan convinces union members and many whites to hate government, what does he do? He cuts taxes. On the working class? No. On the very rich and on corporations. And then he says, and all those routes of upward mobility, those social programs, those are just giveaways to people of color, undeserving people of color. Let's cut those too. And unions? Unions are just sympathetic to people of color. We need to push back against collective action because the reality is you all are on your own. And this idea that government should regulate the marketplace, no, Reagan says, you can't trust government. We should get government out of the way of the market, which is another way of saying we should let the market write its own regulations. And now I say to these union guys, you all love Robert Reich. You love his analysis. You know that he's right. When he says the policies that have bankrupted working American families are tax cuts for the rich, government allowing corporations to write their own rules, the government ending routes of upward mobility, government turning its back on unions, you know that those are the policies that have resulted in the greatest upward siphoning of wealth in the United States in a century. Levels of wealth inequality we haven't seen since the robber baron era, you know that. But what y'all haven't really understood is that those economic policies, or in fancier language, neoliberalism, was sold to the American public through a racial tale. And the racial tale is a story not just about people of color, but it's a racial story about government. Government betrays white folks because it coddles undeserving minorities with welfare and refuses to control them through lax criminal or immigration law. That's the story that the right has been telling for 50 years. And so I say, now I'm going through all of this, and I've got slides, and I've got videos, and I've got campaign ads. They're getting depressed, but they're not sufficiently depressed, so I show them Bill Clinton. And I say to them, here's the deal. The Democrats knew in 1970 that this was going to be Nixon's strategy, but they couldn't figure out how to beat it. And ultimately, Bill Clinton says, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And Bill Clinton starts doing the same thing. Bill Clinton runs as a new sort of Democrat in 1992. In what way was he new? What were his campaign themes? End welfare as a way of life. Well, whose way of life was it, supposedly? Crack down on crime. Well, who were the alleged criminals? And cut the size of government. Those were Bill Clinton's three themes. And so I said to these union folks, the Democrats knew race was being used as a weapon against them. So they walked away from civil rights. They adopted the dog whistle themes that condemned African Americans and Latinos. But when they walked away from civil rights and people of color, they walked away from labor too. And then they turned around and said, well, where are we going to find support? We'll find support through stories of racial fear, and we'll find support on Wall Street. And so I say, since the 90s, the situation in our countries, our two major parties have been competing with each other to prove who can be toughest on people of color and who can be best for Wall Street. That's where we are, I say. And this is, now we're getting, it's, you know, this, well, I've been going on for a while, I've been droning, and now I say to them, I know we're about to break for lunch. I know we're about to break for lunch. But I say to them, do you see a future for your own kids in your union? And to a man, and the leadership's all men, to a man, they shake their heads. There's no future for their kids in their union. And then I say to them, and you know why that is? It's racism against black and brown people, sold as hatred of government, sold as hatred of collective action like unions, that has destroyed your union. The biggest threat to your white family has been racism against black and brown people. And then we go to lunch and I get out of there. Because I'm not really sure what's about to happen. We break for lunch, we come back. The union leaders who, at the start of the day, scoffed at the idea of racism as a problem in their union, all of a sudden start asking questions like, what is implicit bias? What is unconscious racism? What are the best practices to integrate a union? They acted as if they didn't know those terms and then those weren't real concerns. But when they came to understand that racism against black and brown people imperiled their white families, they became committed anti-racists. Right? Or at least, let me not oversell the moment. Sufficiently committed to really engage on those questions. What this particular union did afterwards, I'm not sure. The risk is high that they did very little. And the risk is high that they did very little in part because what I was urging upon them was a paradigm change. We are all stuck in a paradigm in which race is a conflict between whites and people of color. And within that paradigm, which is the one that we're all moving in all the time, within that paradigm, frankly, it's not in the interest of whites to do much about racism. And I was saying to them, try another paradigm. Racism is the principal weapon of the rich being used against all of us. Within that paradigm, the number one thing they need to do to fight for their union is to fight racism against black and brown people. But that's a hard thing to get your head around when all your life you've been in this other paradigm. Right? And so again, I'm not sure what happened then. I do want to draw out, though, this very important lesson. Here's the key insight. We are not fighting a class battle in 2020. This is not about class. Class? These union guys know this. They know class. They spend a lot of their time talking about class. And they know, though they don't make this public, that a majority of their members voted for Trump in 2016 and are likely to do so again in 2020. These are the guys who spend all their time thinking and talking about class. They know class. Class isn't solving this. This is race. This is racial resentment. But having said that, I want to be clear. I'm not actually taking the opposite position that this is race, not class. This is class through the lens of race. It's class through the lens of race. If it were just class, you would see very high levels of support for Donald Trump among the people of color who make up a significant and soon a majority of the working class in America. If it were class. But it's not class alone. It's class through the lens of race. It's people's perception of losing ground, or people's perception of others gaining on them, or people's pessimism about the future, seen through the lens of race, that explains class resentment among the working class. Right? So this is a story that says, and I know I'm overemphasizing this, and the only reason is because so many pundits keep getting it wrong over and over and over. It's driving me a little bit batty, so I'm losing it on this one. I can't tell you how many times I see we gotta reach out to the white working class that turns out to be just an argument about class, and there's no attention to race, and there's no attention to xenophobia or sexism or any of that stuff. And it's like, you missed it. You missed it. What we are fighting here is a question of people's sense of who they are and where they belong and who threatens them and who defends them. And what has happened is that the economic elites, the billionaire class, has sold many working people a story that says, what makes you special is that you're white or male or honorable or hardworking or evangelical or the head of the household. And the people that threaten you are all of these cultural dissenters who want you to recognize the equality of people of color or women or homosexuals. And the ones who will defend you are the people who are pushing back against political corruptness, like Donald Trump. Ignore the fact that he's actually a billionaire. Ignore who the Koch brothers are while they fund the Tea Party and its raging racial resentment. Ignore the economic titans. Focus on other people who differ from you in terms of race or class or religion or sexual orientation. That's the story they've been told. Can we tell a different story? Let me shift the scene. It's the fall of 2019. I am traveling the country talking to people about thinking about racism as a weapon of the rich, as a different paradigm around which we can build a multiracial movement of working families. I'm in North Carolina and I'm talking to a progressive table in North Carolina. The table is, they call it the table, it brings together the leadership of lots of different progressive groups so they can coordinate strategy, debate strategy. Yeah, coordinate is, yeah, that's a little optimistic. So that they can debate whatever the various strategies are they're pursuing. Most of the folks in the room are African American. A few Latinos, a few whites, most African Americans. And on one level, they're cool with a strategy that says, yeah, we need to think about racism as a weapon of the rich. And on the other, they're really skeptical. And one form of the skepticism is this idea that simply calling Trump a racist is a mistake. That if we call Trump a racist, it simply reaffirms this idea of a white, non-white racial conflict. And so I say, that's an easy one. I say, you know, I don't mind you calling him a racist, but make sure you call him a strategic racist. Make sure you identify it as racism is a billionaire's con. Don't call him a bigot, because he actually loves it when you call him a bigot. He turns around and says to his base, see, they're calling you bigots too. We really are locked in this conflict in which these liberal elites look down on you and think you're racist, right? So don't do that. But that's not to say ignore race, just call him a strategic racist. Call him a con artist, right? That's great. So, okay, we're good on that. But there's a deeper concern, and they say, we are nervous about any sort of reframing of racism in a way that's designed to make white people comfortable. We are nervous. We don't, right? Usually they're kind of trying to figure out how to say this, but what they mean is, you gotta be kidding me, right? You're coming into this room, we've been working our whole lives on racial justice, and you're telling us that you want us to switch from thinking about racism as a white over non-white dynamic, which we have lived our whole lives, and start talking about racism as a weapon of the rich, because this is going to make white people comfortable? Give them room to come into coalition with us? You got to be kidding. And so one way for me to answer that is to say, look, I get why there's resistance to shifting the way we talk about racism in a way designed to make whites comfortable. Frankly, the political strategy of the Democrats for 50 years has been to shift the way we talk about race in order to make whites comfortable. Honestly, that's a lot of their strategy today. To shape our conversation about race in a way that ensures that as few whites as possible are troubled by the conversation, with the underlying intuition being to win in 2020 you need as many whites as possible, and if that means you can't fully address the concerns of communities of color, then so be it. That's what Democrats have been doing for 50 years. A lot of racial justice folks, we've seen it, we've been there, we recognize that, and there's an immediate sort of tendency to say, is that happening again? But even more fundamentally, there is a deep skepticism that we can trust whites as a member of a multiracial coalition. And I'm saying to folks, we got to do this, we got to be a multiracial coalition. And they're saying back, why? Why would we be part of a multiracial coalition? And now this is the part where I kind of pivot to my own autobiography and I say, listen, I came into this work as someone really concerned with racial justice, with justice for communities of color. I came into this work, this particular work, looking at the way in which politicians exploit racial division as a way to understand and try and do something about mass incarceration. And here's what I've come to realize. I came into this work from that paradigm of racism is fundamentally a conflict of whites against people of color. And from within that paradigm, the skepticism that whites are ever going to join a multiracial coalition in meaningful numbers is entirely warranted. Yes, if we call for cross-racial solidarity, we might get 10 or 15% of some really amazing white folks. But for most whites, the idea that they need to sacrifice themselves, their privilege, their position, their status, the futures of their children, in order to do what's right for people of color who are over there, who are distant from them, who are potentially threats to them, that's not a reality. That's not going to happen. And most people of color know that. But here's what I try and emphasize. That analysis is rooted in understanding racism as fundamentally a conflict between whites and non-whites. What if that analysis is wrong? What if racism isn't fundamentally about conflict between whites and non-whites? What if racism fundamentally is a weapon of economic titans against all of us? Not in a way that we all suffer the same, precisely because of racism. The harms to communities of color are especially dehumanizing and devastating. We're not all suffering the same. But who's profiting the most? Who's turning around and funding this? Who's making sure that racial resentment actually develops and spreads? That's the story of somebody like Donald Trump, or the Koch brothers spending heavily to defend their petrochemical industry by investing in racial fear in the Tea Party, or the Mercers making billions on Wall Street and then turning around and funding Breitbart. These are folks who are billionaires investing heavily in racial conflict so that we'll war with each other while they laugh all the way to the bank. And if that's what's really happening, and I think it is, then that opens up a different possibility. A possibility of a multiracial coalition founded upon self-interest. The self-interest of every racial community, of every family, white or non-white, to come together because a multiracial coalition, people power, is the only way to stand up to the power of concentrated wealth. That's this alternative possibility. And then to bring it back to racial justice, I say, talk to me about the greatest harms to communities of color in the United States today. Mass incarceration and police violence. Mass deportation. The violence of systemic neglect and disinvestment. The water crisis in Flint. Our dilapidated and failing schools. These are the things that are destroying the lives of our families and our children's futures right now. And where do those come from? And if you're in this other paradigm of whites versus non-whites, your answer is white racism. And if you believe it's white racism that's doing all of this, how do you think you're going to solve it? How do you think you're going to change it? And you end up believing you can't. And you end up saying, I can just organize on the margins among communities of color. So that's all we can do. But what if the answer is the greedy rich? What if the answer is Nixon and Reagan and Bill Clinton campaigning with each other, not because they actually care all that much about hurting people of color, but because they care deeply about winning votes and serving the interests of their dark money funders. And it's those folks, ultimately, who lobbied for, campaigned for, drafted, enacted, and signed the legislation that built the prisons, that deported millions of people. Barack Obama understood damn well that fear of immigrants was going to be used against him, and he became the deporter-in-chief. He responded to dog whistle politics by trying to imitate it, by trying to head it off. He deported 3 million people, broke 3 million families as strategy. And what does that mean? if you want to end mass deportation, if you want to end mass incarceration, if you want to reinvest in communities of color, the only way to do that is to drive out of office these dog whistle politicians. And the only way to do that, a multiracial coalition that invites whites in and makes sure working white families understand that they have their own interest in driving out those politicians. Okay. Now, I think I'm pretty darn convincing. So hopefully that's enough, but I suspect it might not be. So in addition to all of this, a couple of years ago, I connected with a communication specialist, Anant Shankar-Osorio, with a think tank leader, Heather McGee. We then teamed up with SCIU, and we ran a near $1 million 2-year research program to try and test these ideas. And what we wanted to know is, with the right using coded messages of racial fear, what's the best way the progressives can fight back? And we did focus groups all across the country with all sorts of different racial groups. Then we did national polling, national representative polling. The results are both in some ways shocking and in other ways really, really encouraging. So I want to start with the shocking, the dismal. I'm going to read you a message we tested. So we're thinking to ourselves, listen, the right is using coded messages of racial fear. How effective are they? How powerful are they? I'm going to read you the message we tested. Our leaders must prioritize keeping us safe and ensuring that hardworking Americans have the freedom to prosper. Taking a second look at people coming from terrorist countries who wish us harm, or people from places overrun with drugs and criminal gangs, is just common sense. And so is curbing illegal immigration, so our communities are no longer flooded with people who refuse to follow our laws. We need to make sure we take care of our own people first, especially the people who politicians have cast aside for too long to cater to whatever special interest groups line their pockets, yell the loudest, or riot in the streets. Now this is a Berkeley crowd, and you're probably thinking that's a bunch of racist hooey. But that's not how the majority of Americans hear that message. Majority of Republicans loved it. Majority of Democrats agreed with it, found it convincing. Majority of union households agreed with it, found it convincing. So then you might be saying to yourself, that's okay. People of color are going to save us. They're 40% of the Democratic Party, but they're the most energetic, and they at least saw through this nonsense. But you'd be wrong. If you break down level of agreement by racial group, 61% of whites found that dog whistle racial fear message convincing. So did 60% of Latinos. So did 54% of African Americans. And if you look at, so we did this on a dial test, 0 to 100, anything above 50 is agree, 100 is you couldn't agree more, you just love it. So if you look at the people who dial to 100, right, they're just like, this is me, I see you, Donald Trump, and I got you, me, I love it. We got to keep out those illegals. 16% of Latinos and 15% of African Americans dial to 100 on that message. So this idea, this is coded dog whistle fear. Coded in the sense that it is designed to trigger racist stereotypes. I got it. These are racist stereotypes. I'm not saying they're not. That's what this is triggering. But when it uses this seemingly neutral language, illegal immigrants, sanctuary city, terrorist countries, people who mean us harm, that comes across to most Americans, including most people of color, as common sense. Okay, so now we said, well, how is it that Democrats have been responding? One way to respond is to call out this sort of message as racism. I mentioned earlier that doesn't work too well, but we tested it. It turns out a sort of a racial justice message, and because of time, I won't read it to you, though in Q&A I'm happy to. That racial justice message, though, we need to take care of communities of color, we need to end mass incarceration, we need to make sure that America lives up to its ideals and help people of color, single worst performing message, even with communities of color. Single worst. Okay, now, why would it fail with whites? Because it implies that whites are part of the problem, that whites are racist. They don't like it. But it also fails with people of color, and we think it fails with people of color for a couple of reasons. One, skepticism. They don't think it's going to happen. And two, the sense that it tells a story in which the problems we all confront in our lives, the story that people of color confront, is a racist president, beloved by millions of Americans, backed by 400 years of racism. And I think a lot of people of color responded in our focus groups. A lot of people of color responded by saying, I can't do anything about that. I can only take care of myself. It wasn't a message that mobilized people. Okay, so that's one approach. Another approach, and this is the sort of dominant approach of Democrats today, understand that addressing race directly turns off whites, and they don't know this, they don't care, they just worry that it turns off whites, but it also has a negative effect on people of color. But understand that what the calling Trump a racist or calling for racial justice for communities of color directly is not a good strategy. So run silent on race. Don't talk about race at all. And a good way to see this strategy is a better deal. The program that the Democrats announced right after Trump won office, or right after the inauguration, it was like the summer of 2017, they said a better deal, and they had a bunch of lukewarm economic policies and said nothing about race. Another way to see this strategy is impeachment. Democrats convinced themselves that they could impeach Trump by telling a story that had nothing to do with race or division. Here's the story Democrats told through impeachment. Donald Trump bends the rules of democracy in order to win re-election. That's the basic story. Donald Trump bends the rules of democracy in order to win re-election. But here's the news. Donald Trump tells the same story about himself. That's what he means when he says, I don't believe in political correctness. That's what he means when he says, rough those people up. That's what he means when he says, there are millions of illegals voting. What he means is, I will violate the norms of democracy to win election because that's what I have to do to protect you. Donald Trump's basic story to white folks is, we're losing power and we're losing power quickly. And if we want to defend ourselves, we have to defend ourselves aggressively, even if that means bending the norms. Indeed, Donald Trump is saying, the reason you should support me is because I alone will bend those norms. And so the Democrats have turned around and said, we're going to tell a story about Donald Trump as bending the norms of democracy. Oh, shocking news. No, the Republican base didn't move. And indeed, actually, support for Trump has gone up. And because the base didn't move, no Republican senator needed to move. Democrats needed to tell a different story. And the story they needed to tell is this one. And again, they could have told this through impeachment, but let me tell you the race-class story. It's the story I shared with the unions. It's a story I shared in North Carolina. Here's one version of it. We tested 9 different versions, but this is just one. No matter where we come from or what our color is, most of us work hard for our families. But today, certain politicians and their greedy lobbyists hurt everyone by handing kickbacks to the rich, defunding our schools, and threatening seniors with cuts to Medicare and Social Security. Then they turn around and point the finger for hard times at poor families, black people, and new immigrants. We need to join together with people from all walks of life to fight for our future, just like we want better wages, safer workplaces, and civil rights in our past. By joining together, we can elect new leaders who work for all of us, not just the wealthy few. This is what we're calling the race-class message. The core of the race-class message is to identify racist division as a strategy of the rich, and then to call for coming together across race lines to take government back for working families. Notice, and this is super important, this is an explicitly race-conscious argument. There's no colorblindness here. This takes on racial division centrally, name racial division as a weapon of the economic elites against all the rest of us. And it calls explicitly for racial solidarity to come together across race lines. This is explicitly race-conscious. while at the same time making crystal clear that whites are included. And this is the big difference between this approach and an approach that calls out the racism in general. A message that calls out the racism in general, or that calls for taking care of communities of color, implies to most whites that the Republicans are right, that liberals care about people of color and not about them. It becomes incredibly important for progressives to say to white folks, who are you in America? You are another racial group that will thrive when you build common cause across race lines. What is the right saying to whites in America? The right is saying you are embattled, you are beset, you're losing power, fight back now because it's all about to end. Go get a gun. The left, for the most part, isn't saying anything to whites. Except we got some people saying you got to check your privilege, and not super helpful. We need a message that says, whites, you are who you think you are, another racial group in this country. Your future depends on joining this multiracial alliance. Now, it's also true that no multiracial alliance is going to succeed unless whites do think about and work on the way in which they are relatively privileged vis-a-vis people of color. A multiracial alliance depends upon real efforts at repair. But notice the sequencing. We're not saying to whites, hey, you ought to do the right thing. Come help communities of color. We're saying to whites, save your families by joining in coalition with people of color. And to make that coalition real, take care of your brothers and sisters across the race line. Right? That's the race class message. We tested 9 versions. This is where I'll conclude, and then we'll open it for Q&A. We tested 9 versions of the race class message. We had hired these pollsters, the communication specialist. Everybody was like, you know, Ian, this is going to be bad. This is going to be bad. Just people who've never heard this message, a familiarity effect. They've been listening to messages of racial fear for 50 years. Our plan is to lose, but not lose too badly, and then we can get funding and we can try again in a few years. All 9 versions of the race class message beat the dog whistle racial fear message. All 9. Not just with the progressives, not just with people of color, but with the majority of whites and with the majority of what we're calling the persuadable middle, the 60% of American voters who toggle between reactionary and progressive values. All 9 race class messages beat the racial fear message. And it's not just in the context of this research. Anat Shankarsori, the communication specialist, then consulted with Minnesota. Minnesota in 2018 developed a full race class strategy. And if you look at the results in Minnesota, Wisconsin goes red, Minnesota goes blue, Minnesota takes back the state house, wins every executive level office in Minnesota. It's an incredible sweep for Minnesotan Democrats. And their slogan was greater than fear. When they try and divide us, we're onto them. When we come together, we can make this the state we want it to be. And their ads also featured hot pots, which I guess is this thing in Minnesota. There have been some incredible studies. This is very, very effective. It's very powerful. Will it work? You know, is this a sort of, we got this? You know, we were joking earlier, after Iowa, I'm feeling super confident. What could go wrong? There's so much work that needs to be done. The point I want to communicate is, though there's so much work to be done, there is a good strategy that has proved out in terms of being the single most powerful, most potent political message in the United States today, right or left, the single most potent political message in the United States today. Economic titans are explicitly using race to divide us, and when we come together across race lines, we can take government back and make this the country we want. That works. Now all we got to do is put that into action. All right, thank you all. Questions, please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. I love it. It makes tons of sense to me. And curious about what kinds of contacts you have, how that message is filtering through the election, the campaign strategies and so on?
It's a really great question, and I actually wanna pick up an element of what you said initially, and then answer the precise question you said. It makes tons of sense to me. I want to highlight that this is an approach that really resonates with people, with most people. Most people understand that we are racially divided in a way we haven't been in decades, and they're sick about it. The Republicans are saying, yeah, and we're racially divided because those people are dangerous. So they have a story. But most people sense and are sick about how deeply divided we are by race. And most people have a sense that the system's rigged and that the rich are getting richer and the rest of us are getting screwed. And this story, by putting those together, registers with a lot, it just resonates with a lot of people, gives them a frame, right? So, and I think that's part of its power. Now, what's happening with the Democrats as, on that sort of level of the campaign? No matter how radical the candidate, they have surrounded themselves with consultants who are quite little c conservative in the sense of being super cautious. They want to get to 50% plus one or whatever their strategy is, and they're going to do what they've done in the past. What have Democrats done in the past? They've either tried to stay away from race and only talk about economics, or they've tried to pander to communities of color by lifting up racial justice, whether they have credibility in doing that currently or not. That's what they're doing still. That let's do both doesn't work. There's a basic tension in what they're doing. The tension is most Democrats understand, firmly believe, they must choose between energizing whites or mobilizing communities of color. And they feel like there's two different messages to do those two different things. And they feel like, well, they're going to try and do both and try and hope that people don't notice that they're doing the other, right? A great example of this tension, Bernie Sanders accepting and celebrating the endorsement of Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan is this figure who's popular among young white men. He aligns himself with the alt-right. He celebrates the alt-right. He's a terrible misogynist. He's a terrible homophobe. But he also identifies with economic populism. When he offered to endorse Bernie Sanders, Sanders accepted the endorsement, but even more, produced a video celebrating it. Sanders is operating within a model that says, I need white folks, even though they have some reprehensible views. And I also need folks of color, so I'm going to have some great racial justice policy prescriptions, and he does. What Sanders needs to recognize is this is a false choice, and operating in terms of this false choice is incredibly destructive. Sanders could win both whites and people of color by recognizing that the economic revolution he wants to wage can only be fought by addressing racism, precisely because in the class war the rich are winning. Their main weapon has been racial division. Right? And if Sanders were to say, racial division is the weapon the rich are winning to win the war, the class war we're in, to win our class war, to achieve our economic revolution, we are going to fight racism against black and brown people. And hey, Joe Rogan, I'm glad you endorsed me, but you got to understand, if you want economic populism for your peeps, you need to check your racism against people of color. You need to check your homophobia. You need to check your transphobia, because all of that is precisely how economic populism loses and loses and loses, and we re-elect billionaires like Donald Trump. That's how, right? And so this is the way in which Democrats have been slow to do this. Part of it is the consultants, and part of it is they're still operating within this familiar frame. Here's some good news. This approach is sufficiently successful that pretty substantial sums of money are now starting to come into the race-class approach to test its efficacy. Not to start running it, but 3 different programs that I know about are spending big sums of money to test how well this works, with results expected over the next couple of months. And I'm hopeful that if this proves out when it's tested by these folks who are, all we want to do is win, folks, If this proves to be the most effective, then you'll see then you'll see a political consultant class come in and say, all we want to do is win. Turns out this is the best communication strategy for doing so.
Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. And you convinced me that this approach and this message is and can be effective. I want to share
But have I convinced you to buy the book?
Yeah. Now, I'll buy the gold-plated one with the lettering. But I wanted to share with you my adventure watching a Super Bowl game. I'm from Kentucky. And the conversation on the couch during the Super Bowl game was, well, I'm buoyed by the fact that we got rid of Bevin, our governor. We did a good thing, and that gives me hope, one gentleman says, that we can oust Trump. And another gentleman says, but what's different between that gubernatorial race and this one is, and the presidential one, is that we're going to have the foreign interference, we're going to have the gerrymandering, and we don't have the Federal Commission on Elections anymore, and the person who's in charge, if that's out of whack, is Barr. So infrastructurally, even if we have the right message, we have these other things that we haven't blocked. How can I respond to that gentleman on the couch?
Burst into tears.
Yeah.
Gnashing of teeth. So here, it's a really great question. Here's a way to think about it. Everything else being equal, we still face huge structural problems. And the structural problems are, some of them are self-inflicted, like the Electoral College and the Senate. Incredibly difficult to change, but there they are. Some of them are products of very aggressive violations of democratic norms, legal violations of democratic norms, the gerrymandering, the disenfranchisement. Some of them are foreign interference and a refusal to actively, to effectively protect against it. All of those challenges are real. I think it's important, though, that we understand that the root challenge we face is the power of a racial narrative to divide us and to make a significant segment of the electorate complacent about assaults on democracy, right? And so I'm often in conversations with people who are like, you know, I know how to save democracy. We need to enact these electoral rules and these rules with respect to districting and these rules with respect to getting money out of politics. And I'm like, super. And at what point do you anticipate having the majority that will do that? Right? There's a sort of cart before the horse problem. You can't come up with a list of structural solutions unless you understand why so many Americans are willing to tolerate, indeed embrace and defend major structural flaws in American democracy. And why is that? Because what the right is saying to them is, you're losing position. This country's going brown and black. And the only way to defend ourselves is to bend the rules of democracy. And when we look at public polling and we ask people, would you be willing to sacrifice some element of democracy to make sure your side win? Large numbers say, yeah, let's get to it. Because that's what they've already been doing, right? And so one of the big things that animated the Tea Party was the sense that people who didn't deserve to vote were voting. People are willing to violate democratic norms to assure power for their group when they're thinking the best way to take care of themselves is to protect the power of their group defined in racial terms. We cannot build the popular majorities that will change the legislature, that will change the structural rules of American democracy until we build cross-racial solidarity sufficient to encompass a very strong plurality, perhaps a majority of whites. I think we can get there. That is, I think that we can create a multiracial movement that includes half or more of whites. Indeed, this point is a very important point. Donald Trump's base is not white folks in particular, and it's certainly not the white working class, it's white evangelicals.
That's right.
It is a cultural identity. Why white evangelicals? White evangelicals are the sort of perfect storm for Republicans, rooted deeply in racial segregation, rooted deeply in patriarchy, and when I say rooted deeply, I mean since the 70s, but purposefully, right? They shifted towards a very aggressive defense of patriarchy as a political project organized by the right in the 70s, but is now deeply internalized within white evangelical churches, and also deeply committed to free market fundamentalism. That's a project that goes back to the 30s and the 40s, as Kevin Cruz demonstrates in his scholarship. That's the base, but that's 25%. That's not, right, we can get a majority and maybe even a significant majority of whites to commit to the idea that the future, the best possible future for their families, depends upon a functioning democracy in which all racial groups are empowered and represented. That's when we'll have the political power to change these structures, and not until then. Until then, it's part of what's been weaponized against us. But it's also part of what we can only solve when we build that cross-racial solidarity.
Thank you for accepting my oral question. I appreciate you doing so. I just want to interject. You know, a lot of times when ordinary black people actually follow the rules, in the case previously, we lectured at the Broward Center of written questions, and are the first to do so, they still get shuffled to the back of the bus or even off the bus. And so I'd like to ask you the question that was shuffled off the bus when there were written questions at the Broward Center, probably by a moderator who didn't understand the significance. I just want to say, you know, a lot of non-ideological white Trump supporters voted for Obama twice, and then they voted for Trump. But my real question is, Columbia University white male so-called progressive professor Mark Lilla, who came to UC Berkeley to rail against so-called identity politics, especially that of historically traditional American people of color, as supposedly costing Democrats elections, while of course not seeing his own affluent professional straight white male group as an identity politics group, but as a universal, came to UC Berkeley in a year when the alt-white racists were clamoring to come speak at UC Berkeley, but he had like a 98% full auditorium on the other side of campus of older, white, affiliated UCB people who ate up his every word. And I said very civilly that when I heard Mark Lilla, I thought of him as a white racist alt-left. And I suffered a penalty by many of the good white, well, some of the good white liberal academics at UC Berkeley for daring to say that. So you said before at the Broward Center that you don't think much of Mark Lilla. His message is very specious, in spite of it being ahistorical and atheoretical. So since we have a camera here where more people will be able to hear you, can you elaborate on why you said you don't think much of Mark Lilla?
Yes, it's a really great question, and I want to answer it on two levels. On one level, we need to be quick to dismiss somebody like Mark Lilla who says the left is imperiled by identity politics, we need to move away from it, because that's just ignorant as a matter of understanding political science. The best political science now is coming to the conclusion that it's all identity politics. Everyone is voting in terms of their identity. Everyone is voting in terms of fundamental questions of who they think they are, who they think they are in relationship to, who they think threatens them, and who they think defends them. It's all identity politics all the way down. And anybody who says we should reject identity politics, on one level is just nonsense on stilts. Of course we have to engage with identity politics because it's always identity politics. It's identity politics for everybody. Let's think seriously and critically about what those identities are and how they're formulated and how we can suggest different sorts of conceptualizations of one's identity. So that's on one level. Here's the more hard-hitting level. Lilla is drawing upon a tradition within the academy of pushing back against people of color and women who've raised questions about the epistemological influence of gender and racial identity on the production and dissemination of knowledge. He's drawing on a 1980s debate in which people of color and women coming into the academy for the first time started saying, being a person of color, being a woman matters to how we know what we know, to how we interact with the text, to the way we teach, to the way we're perceived, and so too, by the way, does being white or male. And Lilla's defense, this 1980s defense, was to sidestep substantive engagement with the argument, and instead to engage in a series of sort of cheap ad hominems to say, you all are playing identity politics, whereas we are objective. Right? And it was like, you are children, we're the adults in the room. One step deeper. Why? Because Lilla was operating within an intellectual paradigm that understood race as primarily a conflict between whites and people of color. And within that paradigm, when people of color challenged racial hierarchy in the elite white spaces that constitute or that describe American higher education, the most elite schools in American higher education, many whites fought back by saying, we refuse to acknowledge race. We refuse to see ourselves in racial terms as a matter of self-defense. We will not consider whether we are white because we don't want to, and we have the power to ensure that we don't have to. And the way we're going to do that is to belittle our critics and then to exclude them from our departments. Right? That was the move, that was the attack on identity politics and political correctness from the 80s and 90s that Lilla simply reprised after Donald Trump's election. It reflects a really dangerous aspect, a really dangerous tendency among many white liberals, including in the political space, in the foundation world, in the union world. Many white liberals, many of the white left, are willing to sign on to a project of racial repair so long as it's tightly contained. Their racial liberalism extends to token efforts to help communities of color. But they draw a sharp and hard line at the idea that their position and that their institutions fundamentally reflect the way in which race has structured the distribution of power and status in the United States for 300 years. And why would they reject that? Because they understand themselves as directly threatened by that critique. Maybe consciously, most likely subconsciously. When I say we need to build a multiracial movement predicated upon whites understanding that the future of their children depend on joining that movement, what I mean is we need to have a conversation with whites. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. We're going to have to get to how our institutions are actually structured. We will have to get there. But we need to get there first by saying to most white folks, saving yourself, saving your institution, saving your union, saving your foundation, saving your democracy, and frankly, saving the planet from climate collapse depends on you dealing honestly with race. And you haven't wanted to, you've been defensive, you haven't thought that your own fate depended on it, but it does. Put differently, remember that conversation that I had with the white union leaders? It's the same conversation I try and have with a lot of my white colleagues here at Berkeley. And I'll tell you who's more open to it. Those union leaders. Right? But it's the same conversation. We are in this boat because so many whites in power have refused to take seriously the vast scale on which race has structured our economy, our government, our sense of collective enterprise. And until we challenge that, until we pivot on that, until a majority of us, including empowered segments of the white community, accept that the well-being of their family depends on dealing with racial division, on healing it, on overcoming it, on building a sense of linked fate with people of color, until they get there, we're going to be stuck in this rut in which we have a continued denial from people in authority that race is really that big a problem. Right? And this is part of what we're seeing among Democrats. Frankly, it's part of what we're seeing in the campaign consultants, the foundations, some of the unions. It's very much what we've seen among an intellectual class. Frankly, it's very much what I see among a lot of the media pundits. New York Times. Who are those folks? Right? And how open are they to a thoroughgoing racial analysis when they've been resisting that analysis about the New York Times itself? Right? So this is the challenge. Just as we have to convince union folks that their fate depends on building cross-racial solidarity and really engaging with the ugly practices of their own unions, we have to have that same conversation with everybody in the United States, including elite whites who think of themselves as racial liberals.
Thank you very much for a very articulate answer. By the way, no less than Arlie Hochschild, the progressive darling of the liberal arts side of this university, wrote a very nice blurb on the back of Mark Lilla's book.
I'm sorry to hear that. Let me see, the question in the back and then a question up here. And we'll, go ahead, please.
I agree with you that racism is central in the United States, but it seems to me, I hate to say it, the Bushes and Trump have been successful, not at just making racial appeals, but combining blatant American militarism, anti-communism, anti-terrorism, and now Islamophobia and xenophobia, and that's a lot of phobias, but also anti-abortion politics. And that's one thing people on the left are ignoring. And it's not just white Christians who are anti-abortion. There's a lot of black Baptists and Catholics who are anti-abortion. And I agree we have to do this kind of fused racial class analysis. But it seems to me if you want to defeat Trump, we also have to make a kind of a broader popular appeal to American, what I would call American populism, American ideals. And I don't have any problem saying that Trump is a sleaze. This guy's an asshole. He's a total misogynist. He's corrupt. He's a criminal. This guy is sleazy. He's an embarrassment to the United States as a president. The stuff he says and the shit he does is embarrassing. And this is, I think, the failure of the Democratic Party. And I think as long as the neoliberals are in charge, the Democrats are going to lose, because I'm going to be honest, Bill Clinton was the same way. And we have to call these people out and say these guys are sleazy. He's a criminal. And that's how I think we can appeal to at least some white Christians and white ethnic groups. And all white people aren't the same. See, I think there's this assumption in Berkeley that all white people are the same. They're not. There are distinct white ethnic groups. My parents came from a Polish immigrant family. There are Irish ethnic groups. They're not all the same.
So we have about 4 minutes left, so...
Sure, I think I agree with much of what you're saying. What I'm pressing is the story that is most effective, and I think the reason it's most effective. Sorry, the story that is most effective is he's intentionally trying to divide us, and that division can be race, it can be gender, it can be sexual orientation or immigration status. This is an intentional strategy to divide us so we fight each other while the economic titans laugh all the way to the bank. The reason I'm pushing this story, and this I want to highlight this, on one level I'm pushing this story because it works. On another level I'm saying it works because the underlying analysis is right. This is what's happening to us. And then most fundamentally, I'm pushing this story because I think this is where we are in the larger history of the United States. We were founded as a revolutionary country under an ideal of democracy in which prosperity is shared because we purposefully try and make out of many one. and recognize in each liberty, and eventually came to recognize the importance of seeing also equality. Those ideals were never fully honored. And to the extent that they weren't fully honored, we remain susceptible to divide and conquer and to rule by the rich. That's precisely where we are in 2020. So when you talk about a new American populism, I agree. We need a new American populism, but it's the old American populism that says out of many one. We thrive as a democracy when we share power, when we share wealth, but that many must include every person of every color, of every orientation, of every religion, and that one must be a one in which we recognize our fates are linked. That, I think, not only is that a powerful message, that is the next great step forward in making real the American Revolution that launched this democracy. Right? And I think that that's the message that we need to take, much more than simply calling Trump names. We have to identify his strategy, the risks he posed to us, and the way in which our deepest ideals already lay out the road that will carry us to the future. Thank you all very much. I think there are postcards with the book, and I understand that there's refreshments of some sort available across the hallway.